He's the CLIR, which is the Council on Library and Information Resources Fellow for Data Curation at Carnegie Mellon University. And Eric will be presenting on research data triage at Carnegie Mellon University Libraries. So take it away, Eric.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. This is great that there's this many people to come listen and follow along. Okay, I'm going to try and share my screen so we have this all worked out. Okay, so if that's working fine, then we're good to go. Okay, great. So I'm presenting on research data triage at Carnegie Mellon University Libraries. I'm Eric Kaltman. My title is a little bit more extensive than just the data curation in the sciences as a result of wearing multiple hats in research libraries, which I'm assuming people would be familiar with anywhere. I also kind of interface with the computer science liaison team here, and I do a lot of work in software curation. But rest assured, this talk will have a lot on liaisons because they're very much involved in our research data processes. So just an overview of what I'm going to try and cover in the next 40 to 45 minutes. We're going to go over a brief description of the kind of academic context that we're functioning in here at Carnegie Mellon and how research data management is organized and addressed. I'll talk a little bit about the workflows for our data repository and then how liaisons function in those. And then the current work on creating and using a data conversations worksheet, which we use to record and manage new deposits into the repository. And then if we have time, we ran a workshop at Open Repositories 2018 on liaison workflows. And so we have some additional feedback from that workshop that would probably be useful for people here if I can get to it. To start off, Carnegie Mellon University was founded in 1900, which is a little inaccurate in that the current University of Carnegie and Mellon, Carnegie Mellon merged in 1968. There were two technical universities that were kind of situated next to each other. The interesting thing about Carnegie Mellon's context is that we're actually a majority graduate student institution. For instance, I work with the School of Computer Science, and there are 7 departments in that school, and 6 of them are graduate only. So our needs for addressing data management are growing by the day, which is why we're trying to get our house in order, and hopefully we're doing it good enough for now. To couch our current work on data repository and its brief history, we hired our first research data consultant, dedicated hire in October of 2013. And then we had to accept our first data set in February 2015, which was actually added at that time to an archival repository because we did not have a data repository set up. But the need to ingest that data set, which was associated with a large grant from NIH, I believe, kind of spurred the administration to realize that we needed a larger repository. In February of 2017, so about 2 years ago now, we partnered with Digital Science, and that included a partnership with the partnership included Figshare for institutions, which is what our current repository infrastructure is built on top of. We named that repository around that time, and it is now called KiltHub, and it started accepting deposits in April 2017. We had full data deposit guidelines and initial policies cemented in March, which seems kind of backwards, but that's how it happened. And then in August 2018, we also started using the Open Science Framework as another way for researchers to share research data and processes. I'll talk a bit more about KiltHub later on. For right now, kilthub.cmu.edu is the front end for it, and we are still actually working with Figshare on modifying it to our needs, which I'll maybe discuss at some point. Feel free to ask questions on it. CMU's context is a little bit different than other institutions as well. We are a very highly siloed institution. A lot of the departments have a lot of independence, and as a result, not many of the CMU departments actually view the library as a center for cross-disciplinary research support. We are basically continually working on convincing different people in different schools and departments that the library can be used as a kind of federated data store, due to the fact that a lot of the people kind of working around the campus are duplicating actual data storage and some other types of uses for research data. As a result of that, we've focused on having our liaison librarians become key members in supporting the individual departments. They are our ambassadors to the rest of campus in that way. And so they're becoming instrumental in integrating with our research data services and support. This kind of is necessary because since each department has very specific data needs, even down to the individual labs and projects, we kind of want liaisons who have disciplinary experience to help manage those materials. We have created some guidelines, which I'll talk through, but they need to be very custom tailored to each individual use and department. And on a larger note, the data repository is kind of seen as a way to centralize a service that is needed by most of our research staff in a way that the library can kind of take a leading role and present itself to campus as a place to get research data services and data storage taken care of. Our current stakeholders and the organizations that we have many researchers and faculty. Their general concerns are for data submission for publication. They are not very focused on clarity for reproducibility and preservation. And due to the stature of many people in the departments, they're very, very busy, which is not unusual for most faculty, but contact is actually kind of difficult. We do a lot of work to try and maintain through liaisons, chatting with and talking to department heads and chairs to make sure that they're aware that the library is doing this work. And so as such, we found that actually graduate students and lab assistants and staff are much, much more open and willing to talk to us about data management. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it generally comes down to they're the ones doing a lot of the actual grunt work with the data in the lab. And so anything that can support that work for them is something that they really welcome. I'll talk more about liaisons in this structure on the following slides, because this is more focused on liaison talk. We also have a research data services team that has come into existence over the last year and a half. This includes basically people from different library departments that have some data training and are actually interested in the research data management problem. Mainly people who have actual research backgrounds in some of the sciences and information science that we happen to have on staff. And so they provide outreach and motivation for better data practices. And we are the research data services team is the team responsible for contacting and getting the liaisons on board with the research data processes. And so I'm a member of that team and a couple other people are. And so we work with getting the staff on board with our new data, with the current research data services that we provide. We also have dedicated people on a repository team, and they are mainly focused on communicating with KiltHub and Figshare directly to manage our development relationship with them and to manage metrics and citations and also validate deposits. As I'll talk about later, we have pretty decent coverage for requirements for data going into our repository, and so they're kind of the last step before anything gets put into our KiltHub institutional repository. On the flip side of this, the administration here is incredibly supportive of this effort. We're really making a push towards data curation and software curation being something that stands out at an institutional level at Carnegie Mellon. This is the fact that a majority of the work going on here takes place in STEM fields. And so there is a lot of grant activity and a significant amount of the funding for the university comes in through large research grants from federal agencies and foundations. And as a result of that, there's a large push to get the data management and data access plans in order due to grant restrictions. Additionally, as I mentioned before, the administration wants our services in this area to be exemplary so that we can bring them and use it as an advertisement for other library services as we go forward. As for liaisons at CMU, we have about 20 librarians in liaison roles, and most of our recent hires in liaison roles have actually been direct disciplinary alignments. So, for instance, our biology liaison was a practicing biologist. Our computational biology liaison is a biologist. Our civil engineering liaison is actually a civil engineering graduate from CMU directly. And our new chemistry liaison was actually a practicing chemist. I myself have a background in computer science and a degree in computer science. And so when I interact with the computer science faculty, that's very, very useful as far as getting them on board with specific research support initiatives. Most departments in CMU have liaison coverage, but most researchers at departments are not aware of that. We are still doing a lot of work to make sure that the people in those departments are understand what the library is offering them. This is also not really the result of any kind of negative relationships between the library and the departments just due to scale. For instance, the School of Computer Science that I help liaison with has over 100 faculty and up to 300 research staff across 7 departments. And so just getting into group meetings to talk to them about this is very difficult. And so we have small islands of support around the larger schools that we're working to build outward from. Yeah, and that I've already mentioned the data repository projects as means for outreach and engagement. As far as the liaison librarians here, they want to provide useful library services to the constituent groups, mainly their disciplinary researchers and students, but we have a bit of a generational gap in the data experience of some of our liaison staff. As I mentioned, the researchers who are coming in have actually worked with research data and done research projects in that way. And so they feel much better equipped to deal with talking directly with researchers about data support. Whereas some of the liaisons who have been here for longer didn't necessarily have a full alignment with their departments and haven't actually been practicing research scientists. And so we're working on getting them better equipped to handle basic data advising and consultation needs, which is the purpose of the forum I'll be talking about towards later in this talk. The other kind of notion that comes up is that even though our liaison librarians are specialized in their fields, they're not omniscient in that field. And so data literacy in one area does not actually lend directly to another even subfield or subdiscipline, as we found. It's better, we found it better to have people who have just general experience managing data, and then they can map that to different research projects. But the mapping is never one-to-one, and it's rare that a specific situation for one researcher is directly copyable to another researcher, even in the same department. And then they're always eager for more tools and help with research data best practices, and they desire really coherent workflows for how we're doing repository interaction, which is what we've been working on here for the last year or so, is just streamlining our process for communicating about data deposits and who provides information about that to the wider liaison community at CMU. To give an illustration of just the breadth of the research data services team, we have 8 people who comprise the unified team. And if you'll notice, 3 of them are kind of from the repository team. We have 4 liaisons on there, and then some people who are just directly involved with research data services, like our data visualization librarian. We are a collaborative body that meets every other week to kind of talk about specific issues and get workflows aligned. And we've unified the research data services team under a combined outward-facing email. So if you have any questions about the university libraries and data services, it comes through one centralized communication channel and then gets delegated to the specific person who's best suited to handle this. And the reason that we did this, organized it in this way, is that when we had started to do an internal mapping of the different skills and support roles that we needed to address for the institution, we came up with over 30 different roles that we could actually see functioning as individual people's jobs. And we don't have that many people. And we actually, as far as the repository is concerned here, have one full-time person who's actually working on the repository, and the rest of this is parts of people's jobs. So we needed a way to align people's skills with specific requests instead of having everyone need to look at everything, which is how we had been doing it previously. Just an example of the roles, I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just some subset of individual roles that we thought could be useful for people requesting information about research data services at the institution. And for instance, on here, I handle data consultation help, our earlier support and our software curation, and other people handle other requests that we get. Okay, so I'm going to go over our basic repository workflow so that you have a better understanding of what the liaisons are dealing with and how they're trying to communicate with faculty. As I mentioned, KiltHub is an instance of Figshare for institutions. Figshare is a much larger open repository for scientific publications and data deposits. KiltHub is CMU's branded interface to it and also a separate Figshare instance. So the way that the Figshare institutional model works is that we have our dedicated space on Figshare, but it is searchable within the larger Figshare site, and it is also indexed on Google Scholar and now on Google's data search. Though that integration is not fully completed yet, but it's nice that when we put stuff into KiltHub, it gets indexed by the larger search engines. KiltHub is now functioning as both our research data repository and our traditional institutional repository. We had a digital commons supported repository up until last year, and then we folded everything into KiltHub. And so all of our traditional scholarly outputs and our data are sitting side by side now. And this is just an elaboration from our policy of what we accept as materials. I don't want to go through this, but feel free to read this slide later and ask me any questions. Our data deposit guide that we had articulated by middle of last year maps directly to the KiltHub interface, and this is the first set of information that we request for data deposits. The required metadata form fields are very, very basic they're just aligned with the actual Figshare application. So title, author, categories, item type, keywords, and description. So it's very loose, and we found that we wanted to have significantly more metadata coverage for data sets. As a result, we came up with a template for a readme .txt that we require for every single data deposit. And this is a bit more extensive. It asks for authors and contacts, a directory of files in the data set, the file naming convention, a data description or dictionary or codebook, software description, equipment description, and dates of data collection. And I have, and as you might see, that's a decent amount of information for someone to provide ostensibly on a self-deposit model, which is what Figshare was initially offers. Everyone at our institution has access to do full self-deposit into the repository, but as I'll talk about in ingest workflows in a second, that's kind of not really tenable given the information that we require. So the README text does have significant drawbacks in that way. It's that it's difficult to moderate free-form text, and so we have to work on specific guidelines with liaisons to make sure that we have examples of good README files that are actually aligned with specific disciplinary backgrounds. In some cases, liaisons can actually work through this, but they don't actually always want more work on this subject, right? It'd be easier if there was a more streamlined process, but we have not been able to articulate it past just allowing a free text file associated with the data. This is one, because the text file will be readable in the future due to the fact that it's incredibly simple, and B, it gives us a lot of leeway into asking for specific clarification of fields. And again, we don't kind of try and make this too onerous for the faculty. We've kind of discovered going through this process that a lot of the people who are doing data production, specifically researchers, are actually not particularly good at describing the minutiae of their data processes. And so we only try to get them far enough to where we think it's interpretable for other people in the field based on their expertise, and we'll leave it as that. So we try not to go back to them, 5 or 10 times to get more clarity on the README file. Essentially, it'll get to a good enough state, and we have to leave it there. Otherwise, we risk losing the faculty member or the researcher's interest. And then the other thing is that the lack of explicit standardization, kind of tries some of their patiences. So we have people who are really into doing the README files and kind of see it as an extension of their research and a way to guide their process, and other people don't really want to deal with it at all. And in that case, the faculty liaison in some cases will have to take over a decent amount of the description if they understand the project enough. Just to give you an example of what a great README file looks like, let me see if I can actually do this. I will share the. This is a data set for our computer and electrical engineering department, electrical and computer engineering department on measures of insulation impedance in a bunch of different materials. So it's a material science project. And this researcher, Mats Forsell, actually was very interested in elaborating on this because it's data for his thesis that's coming out this year. And so as you see here, we have very, very extensive descriptions of all of the different folders and how the different, columns in the spreadsheet map out, even going so far as to explaining the full setup of the mapping files and how, each of the different textual files included in here function. And I mean, I don't understand, and people here to understand this because I certainly don't, but given that I have a background in computer science, I can actually follow this enough that I can read and understand what he's trying to talk about and say, and that the import for his MATLAB scripts and such works. We also provide a decent amount of information on, or require a lot of information on equipment and software, which is very useful for the future because we know exactly what this was run on. But again, this is kind of one of the best examples that we have in the repository. Others are not nearly this extensive. We just happen to have a researcher who is very on board and interested. And it generally skews with the researchers who are graduate students or younger are much, much more into making sure that their data is available, given that I think that they've been dealing with this type of digital information for most of their lives. Okay. So where do liaisons fit in? So the basic data flow triage that we have set up at Carnegie Mellon is that there's pre-deposit work, a conversation about the data, and then the actual data deposit work itself. The pre-deposit or pre-ingest data is essentially can come in from 3 different vectors, and the reason that we wanted to streamline our processes is because it was getting hard to actually manage where data requests were coming from. And so in self-deposit, we just have a researcher who's a faculty, research staff, or support staff, or a student, organize a data set according to the guidelines on our website and get them staged for review in Kiltub. Now, the issue here is that they will generally not follow our guidelines fully, or will have specific confusion about them. And so we will ostensibly just have data show up in the repository, and we need to do backtracking to get them communicated through our process. We have found that in some instances, people who have worked on this repeatedly, for instance, our psychology liaison has done a lot of work with our department. And so the self-deposit information that she's getting now is a lot cleaner than it was a year ago. But again, we're also not talking about a huge number of deposits. I think she's probably done 5 or 6. But it's kind of slowly percolating out into her department. We're hoping that'll be replicated in other areas and other departments that we start working with more. There's producer solicited, so we'll actually have some data producer or researcher find some way to contact us in the library, either through their liaison, our research data consultant, the repository team email, or just find someone at the library to let them know that there's data coming in. And in that case, they will effectively communicate with our research data processes directly and then get into the repository, which is what happened with the example I just showed you, is that we had a graduate student in electrical and computer engineering come to our web interface directly to ask about how to get clean data into the repository, and then we worked with him directly. Those are generally the most productive, is when the researcher actually takes it upon themselves to contact the data repository, because they're generally more motivated to actually do the work correctly, since they already had the interest. In some cases, we do have library solicited data sets in which we will find out about a specific data set held by a producer and ask them if they would like to, organize it and get it into the repository. The issue here is that sometimes we've had people solicit data sets and then realize that we actually couldn't deal with them due to the scale or scope. And so we're trying to work on actually getting the communication processes on this end a little bit more aligned through the data conversation sheet I'm going to talk about, so that we have a pre-warning about specific scale and complexity issues of the data. Our current deposit workflow, if a deposit comes in unsolicited, generally we'll have a deposit administrator who's quarter of someone's job right now is just to monitor incoming data requests and see if someone needs to be communicated with. Generally, you'll always have to contact the researcher to verify that they sent the data, the liaison librarian to make them aware that there's data coming in, and then in this case, the research data consultant or the research data services team to see if there's anyone else on staff who has expertise in this area. In this case, then, we have a bunch of people kind of focused on the data set and taking a look at it, but the communication we tend to try and have between the liaison librarian and the staff or researcher, just to promote a common shared language and discussion between them, and to help ease their interface with the library if they're talking to someone who has a background in their area. I've had numerous conversations with people in my data consultations, and they find it a lot easier to chat with me due to the fact that I have a computer science background and have handled research data for, whatever specific project they're working on. In our case, a lot of machine learning and natural language processing data sets. And so it's easier to kind of chat with them because they feel like you have a common language, which is why the liaisons are actually very useful in this process. If we have a more complex deposit, we'll all kind of communicate and then let the liaison handle communication through to the researcher. In some cases, we'll have a dual channel of communication. For instance, I am kind of a half liaison librarian, but I also help with data consultations, and sometimes I'll communicate with the researcher directly as well. But we try and limit contact to a single friendly interface with the library to help foster and build that relationship. And then after this is worked out, the researcher will organize the deposit according to our guidelines and then put it in for review. Or if there's actually issues that are minor that we can take care of on our own, the KILTUP interface allows us to do minor modifications to the data set, specifically metadata description and some file organization. And so we can actually impersonate the user and then resubmit without having to bother them if there's some minutia that they actually did pretty much correctly, but we have some little nitpick with. In order to help out with this process, which can kind of get pretty complex, we decided that we wanted to streamline the interaction between the liaison librarian and the researcher or the data producer coming in. And so we came up with a data conversation form. In this case, the liaison and the researcher will work on this initial form, which I have a link in the chat, which I'll repost in a second. And they kind of go over very basic information about the incoming data deposit, and then that lets us flag data services and repository services to make sure that everyone's kind of on board that the data set's coming in. And when I talk about liaisons doing communication, what are they actually doing here? They are, as I mentioned, the main communication layer with the faculty. They advise on disciplinary clarity. For instance, in the example I showed you before, I was working with the electrical engineering student to make sure that the content of the deposit was actually interpretable to other people in his field, which is the main criterion. It doesn't have to be totally interpretable to me, but it has to be, reconstructible for someone who he thinks would actually be interested in his work. And so that's kind of the criterion we go to there. And then the liaisons are, again, the main point of contact for data deposits, or we try to have them be. In this case, the more recent hires who have disciplinary background and have more data literacy are a lot more adept at this kind of work. In other cases, some of the liaison librarians will actually reach out and collaborate with us to try and mollify the relationship. So for the candidate that I mentioned a second ago, our electrical engineering librarian has not been doing as much with data recently, and so he sat in on all of the data advising work that we did just to kind of get an understanding of how the process and workflows went through. And that's the edge here, is that the people who've been here longer generally have a lot larger networks and can get into the departments more because they have more time to develop better connections, but they may not be as familiar with data, and so we're kind of managing that by allowing the more recent researcher and research data services staff to help with the liaisons in that way. Because everyone kind of wants to promote data services and encourage researcher contribution because it looks good that we're helping out in a new way for the library. Okay, so how does this possibly work, or does it work fully? Not always. As I mentioned, the liaisons with research background are generally more energized and engaged, but we do have some liaisons who do not perceive data management as a significant issue. So people in a lot of our engineering and data heavy fields obviously see that there's a need for doing this data management work. But we don't have as much buy-in from people in other disciplines, which I'll mention in a little bit. And then the other thing is that it's very dependent on the data producer and the researcher. If we have a researcher who doesn't want to work with us, we can't really force them to. So we tend to find early career researchers are much more receptive to data management messaging, and the graduate students, as I mentioned, who have an easier time doing the grunt work of the science. If their data deposits and the data that they're working with is better organized and described, it makes their life easier, and it makes handover in labs a lot easier, because one of the big issues that we have is that a graduate student will leave and then they'll hire a new graduate student or a new postdoc, and they have to come in and like disentangle this massive data that they don't really comprehend and understand. Whereas if it's actually been organized for the deposit in some fashion, or they've worked with the library a little bit on data management practices, it's a lot easier for them to hit the ground running. And so there's a very big, implicit economic incentive in not wasting the graduate students or the postdocs' time. And then we still have kind of the communication model is in process. As I mentioned, this workflow is identified. We have the stakeholders identified, but we don't have everyone aware of this in the library. We're still trying to even reach out to certain liaisons internally who are from disciplines that are not directly data producing, and getting them on board and convincing them has been a bit more difficult than we had anticipated. I think we've gotten to a little bit over half of the liaison staff directly to talk to them about the conversation sheet that I'm going to describe in a second, and get feedback. Okay, so this brings us to the general meat here is the data conversations form that we've been articulating to help with the liaison interaction with researchers regarding data deposits. And I think for people who are managing this on BlueJeans, is the link still available, or do I need to repost it for people who are on? Because I did put a link in the chat before we talk started, but I don't know if everyone can still see it. I'll just repost it again.
Yeah, this is Leah. The link is still there. Thank you.
Okay, great. And so, I mean, you can follow along. My slides kind of mirror the sheet as well, so I'll just go in here first. So the data conversation form that we have set up is actually essentially a simple Google web form that ties into a spreadsheet on our end that we can use to monitor interactions with researchers and faculty about data deposits, and gives everyone kind of a unified place to look. If there's a data deposit that people are talking about, we have some basic information about it before it enters our pipeline, hopefully. And then this I'll talk through this quickly because I don't want to spend an amazing amount of time on this, given that I want to stop talking in 10 minutes or so. But you can look through the form online that I've linked there. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. We basically just connect contact information, project study description, data size and scope, data restrictions, scheduling for the data, and comments. And then this is a copy. I think this might be an old picture of the form, but you'll have the new one in the link. Contact information is pretty direct. We just want the project owner and project collaborators' emails at the institution and who their library contact is. And then what the description of the project or study, its data, was it funded or not, who's contributing from different departments and other institutions, and then do you have a data management plan? Another kind of important step here is just the data size and scope. We have this broken out by the implicit requirements of the repository. So if we have less than 5 gigabytes of data, online self-deposit is possible. If you have a larger than 5 gigabyte data set, you have to self-deposit, but you can do it through the desktop application. And if it's over 20 gigabytes, then we need to actually set up a dedicated FTP transfer for you. And then if it's greater than a terabyte, we have to actually work on shared funding support, because we don't have funds to hold data larger than a terabyte for each individual user. And then I'm assuming, based on conversations with the repository management, if everyone kind of wanted a terabyte of data, also, I don't know if we'd actually be able to scale to that as well. But right now, the current cutoff for individual data set sizes is a terabyte without having to talk about cost share. And then we kind of get into types of files and what is the estimated total number of files. And then a lot of software information. Is there proprietary software? What was used? And this kind of mirrors a lot of the stuff that'll show up in the README, but we try and get this information as quickly as possible just so that we know what's coming in and how to deal with it. And we have a lot of stuff here tailored to specific issues we've encountered with data consultations. Like, do you have a complete copy of the full data set is asked because we've had people try and submit the data set in chunks, which doesn't work if you have a digital object identifier for the data set, because we need to continually modify it. And I guess you can add versioning to it, but we try and get the entire data set together so that we don't actually have to do further amending later. And then just potential data restrictions on human subjects, scheduling, if there's a time frame for publication, when does it need to be submitted? Our biggest issue is that people generally come to us last minute to get data into the repository. And so we're hoping that getting more information out to the community about the level of description and work needed will help slow their, sending us a request to store data on, the Friday it's actually due, which has happened. We'll get contacted at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday for data that has to go in that day. And so, as I mentioned here, the project and study description gets shared generally with research data services, so we're all aware of it. And if a specific disciplinary liaison needs to be contacted, we go that way. Data size and scope it directly maps to repository constraints, so the repository team needs to get involved. Same thing with scheduling. And then potential data restrictions is also an issue, because if there's certain restrictions, we can't store it in KiltHub because it's an open source data repository. And so we need to kind of have a conversation with them about where else we can store it, what other repositories might be useful, and if the data can actually be stored in a repository in that sense at all, if it includes human subjects or other sensitive data. The current conversation development, it was originally framed as a full data interview for half an hour. We realized that was way too optimistic, and so we tried to get the forum discussion down to 5 to 10 minutes, which is kind of worked out okay. And then we wanted to reduce it to a liaison-aided form submission process so that the liaison can just bring this sheet with them to a consultation or even send it to a researcher and talk them through it. And then it also allows the liaison to initiate the process and provide substantive feedback to the researcher and to researcher requests. We do need to do significant testing and feedback on this. We do have data deposits are pretty slow coming in. I think we probably had like 4 in the last month. And liaisons with research training are obviously much more on board with this. Other liaisons have shown some mild interest in getting trained, but they're still kind of confused about some of the elements of the form, and so we're constantly revising it to be simpler and more direct. We've been doing consultations with liaisons over the last couple months to have them better understand what's going on with this process and see what they might want to, have comments on. And one big thing that has come up recently is that they might not know the actual best practices for the subfield, or that subfield might not even have them. For the researcher that I was talking about with the example earlier, he asked me if there was any electrical engineering best practices for this type of submission for, impedance measurements for materials, and I could not find anything. So there's a lack of general best practices for large segments of the research data corpus that are not known by the researchers themselves, and the liaisons are kind of trying to have to track that down or develop them for ourselves in-house. The generational shift in our library is also mirrored in the younger faculty, as it's become apparent. A lot of the younger faculty are much more aware of data issues, it seems, and much more concerned with actually dealing with and getting those productions saved. And this is kind of also aligned with some of the liaisons not having knowledge of how data is managed in their research contexts. A lot of arts, architecture, music, and humanities work here at Carnegie Mellon is highly interdisciplinary and very involved in technology and even data. But there's not a lot of standard practices in digital humanities or lots of these other fields for the research data management angle of the work. And the liaisons are, if they're trained as like classical, people in music and music libraries and storing, audio and sheet music and that type of thing, the data aspect of like an interdisciplinary music project and how to save it is currently beyond what the basic knowledge is. So we have to raise that up in these contexts. Another thing that we kind of asked for, but we've been asked for numerous times, is to better organize the metrics of the repository and give liaisons a way to sell the data efforts to the staff in their departments, right? To show, here's a specific example of a very good data deposit and how it helped and had active, take up by the field and that type of thing. We have a kind of a chicken and the egg problem here, because we need to get more data deposits to show the usefulness of having data deposits. And I think that's mirrored in a lot of other people I've talked to at other repositories. We also want to streamline our online and quick access to effective documentation. Our research data management information on our website is a amalgamation of multiple years of different work on KiltHub and then on the previous Digital Commons. And we've been trying to actually streamline and get better descriptive information up, which is why we had done the initial data description and deposit work that you saw earlier, and this was done last year, and we're still working on getting the liaison and the conversations form embedded in the website in a way that is easier for researchers to find. And then the last thing we got from them, I think this is the last thing on here, is that put a lot of more I don't knows on that form. We have a lot of yes, no answers. And we realized that a lot of people, even in the research fields, don't really know about certain restrictions on their data, how certain licensing works, and maybe even certain scale issues with their data set. And so kind of embedding this ignorance into the form, we kind of know where we have to go and which directions we need to investigate further, which was something that was a nice information to get back from having the liaison conversations. Okay. So I have about, I guess, 2 minutes before I'm at 45. We did a workshop at Open Repositories. I'm going to leave the slides here. I'll go through just to the basic overview. We had 30 to 60 participants at OR and had them kind of go over comparative review of this workflow back when it was called the data checklist, and then had them work on creating their own checklists and doing requirements drafting for what their internal processes would be. Just to kind of skip this closely, we had people with like 43 different job titles that were vaguely around data curation, scholarly communications. Not very many liaison librarians. It was actually more people in administration interested in how to communicate and organize liaison librarians to help with this work. But it was still a large spectrum of people from different library departments and different roles, which also belies the changing nature of library services and that there's so many different descriptive ways to talk about people who work in data and digital management, digital preservation management. I don't need to, you can look at the graphs and the forms later. I'm just going to go to the end, which has the challenges and feedback. So the biggest issues people had is kind of aligned with what I've been talking about, advertising and getting people aware of library services, getting funding to support these types of things, getting researchers to comply and establishing workflows, and then some specific examples that are directly taken from our workshop form and description, is sustaining active institutional support and getting workflows organized, and then scale. We are quite limited in what we can handle versus what campus needs. We find that too in the library here. We've had people come to us with like multiple terabyte data sets that are incredibly complex, and we currently don't have an immediately good answer for how to ingest and deal with them. And this is just more file storage limitations, limited time and staff, which I think should be familiar with most of the people on this call. Some immediate feedback that came after the workshop is how to handle more metadata for data submissions. How is that managed, and are we collecting the right information? Our shot at that is the README file, as I mentioned before, to see if we could collect a bunch of stuff, but it's not indexed in a really good way yet. And the KiltHub repository is pretty limited in the metadata that we're allowed to collect that is searchable. And they are working with us to add further keywords and better date management for when submissions are published and that type of thing. But it's still not where it needs to be. Liaisons at many institutions are hesitant to get involved in the data management process. And people are actually concerned that the data conversation form that I mentioned would actually cut against saving time in self-deposit. The thing that we found is that the implicit training that comes from people understanding how to have the data conversations and the information that it provides to the people who will need to do data triage down the line does actually save us time, as opposed to previous processes where you'd have data coming in from various different angles and there wasn't a really unified way to talk about it or describe it. And then another kind of bigger issue that came out of the feedback is that a lot of the questions in the data deposit form were questions that should be asked at the beginning of the research process, even during the writing of research grant applications. And so that's another big thing that is coming out of this, is that we need to, or we're attempting to actually try to change processes internally so that people are aware of these types of things before they come with us with a giant data submission. But again, it's very difficult to get into the departments and talk to them about this. We have some inroads in getting into faculty meetings and talking with graduate students in labs. And we're currently, right now, I'm working with our robotics institute to try and describe what a data-forward research process would actually entail, because the graduate students who work in these labs are very, very interested in getting better information about historic lab practices so that they can do better work. Again, external repositories are not mentioned in this talk as much, but we do try and direct people to specific institutional or disciplinary repositories that are not ours if they're better at handling this type of data that they have. This happens a lot with like bioinformatic data and genomics data. There are dedicated repositories for that information that's definitely better than the KiltHub. And then people had very deep existential questions, like whether the library should even be in the data repository business at all. I mean, our argument for that is that someone needs to take a collective and organized look at this on our campus, and I don't think that's very different from other people. Due to the way that the institution here is set up, people tend to replicate tons of work across different departments, and we're really trying to centralize that because it'll save everyone time and everyone money, which is the main impetus for a lot of this. And then just basic next steps. We're working on a lot more workshops and instruction for liaison librarians about how to do repository and data literacy skills, but we're still trying to convince some people to even attend these. Some people are very, very on board, and others are very hesitant because they don't believe it affects their research disciplines. And we've started doing workshops for researchers and graduate students in data best practices. I host those. We do software carpentry for basic coding and Git repository management. And then we're starting to do a lot more outreach to departments and working with the Office of Sponsored Projects here to get our existence aligned with the rest of the university. Carnegie Mellon has had a bunch of large research grants come in recently that need to have much more fine-grained control over data control and deposits, and so the library is now involved in a CMU campus-wide research data group to try and streamline documentation across departments, which is new. That's generally not happened here. You have a lot of people functioning separately, but due to the scale of some of the research work coming in and the data being produced, it's become apparent that everyone kind of needs to get on the same page. Again, we're still reevaluating this entire process. And in the Q&A, I may not be able to answer all of your questions for specific repository or other questions. I handle some of the workflow organization, and I work as a liaison in this context, but I'm not the one responsible directly for repository submissions aside from helping organize them. So if you have interesting questions about those, I can definitely refer them to the people here who would be able to answer them after, the conclusion of this talk. These last links, there's 2 links for the KiltHub informational resources, and then the OSF link here is for the actual workshop that we gave at OR, and this is all of the documentation around that, if people were interested in just how people interpreted this and wanted to talk about it. And I guess I'll just leave that up while I take questions, and thank you. I'm glad I got through that.
Thanks, Eric. All right, so
Sure.
If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute yourself. We'll get to you. I have one quick question for you before we start taking the chat questions. So you in your presentation, you identified that you're trying to get researchers that are kind of early in their career first to kind of get them into good policies and good practice. So what is the biggest or most common barrier of resistance from like established researchers that you've encountered during your outreach?
There's one is the assumption that the library can't actually handle it, that like the data is too big or that they don't trust the handoff to us. Another is that they don't want any extra work. And so if they come to us with a large, data set, and we don't have an immediate answer for how we can immediately get it into the repository, but we have we respond with a bunch of extra questions to contextualize it, sometimes they'll just stop being interested. An example of that is we had a researcher come to us with like a very long established, computational logic system that was an 18 gigabyte, 2-decade long development piece of software. And we didn't immediately have a way to store that, but we were willing to work with him, but he didn't want extra work in that. He just wanted someone to take care of it for him. And so that's been an issue with more of the established people, especially at Carnegie Mellon, is that they really don't perceive themselves to have extra time to work on this. And so if we don't have an immediate answer for them, they tend to just go their own way, which is why we're trying to do more streamlining. So if someone comes to us with a specific, quadrant of information, like I have a large software deposit, it's like, oh, we already did this for someone else, we can do this for you, here's how it works. But that's one of the larger barriers with the older faculty. And then some of the older faculty in humanities and other of the arts and things didn't do as much digital work as their students are doing. And so there's just a divide there about what is important to save and how to actually do that, preservation.
Gotcha. I think Michael had a question in the chat there.
So we have that came directly from, we had a data set coming in for some chemical engineering process, and the person who was submitting it was one of the research staff who was doing work on it. But apparently he had not really ever had to articulate like the minutia of how the data was created through the machine, and wasn't particularly good at actually articulating like his process. He had just been doing this for years, and he had this pretty complex and opaque manner for organizing his data and processing it, but he'd never really had to explain it to someone else because the people who he was giving it to were only cared about the results and not the actual process of what he was doing. And so we actually had to have our biology liaison, who was working with him because he was doing some work in chemistry and biology, sit down for 2 sessions just to kind of translate how he was describing his process into a way that it might be understandable to someone else. But we were incredibly surprised by that. It's just that a lot of the methods and stuff for data management apparently don't have to make it into papers. If you have the results and you have some basic methodology, like I use this machine to do this, the actual like nitty gritty of the data management is usually not shared. And some people in that area actually aren't trained in sharing it. They're research staff who are dedicated to producing something from a specific set of machines, and haven't actually really had to talk about or think about how to articulate their process aside from their specific job role.
All right, I'm just going to read these out loud for the recording. Matthew Harp says, for those contact that do come early in the research lifecycle, like proposal or active phase, how does the conversation form factor into the process, and what becomes of the info?
So if we have someone come in and they have they approach us, the general thing is that the specific liaison or person who's more familiar with that specific data set will fill the conversation form out, and then there's just a shared Google sheet that gets updated with that information that other people can check out. Like, we don't have a very advanced system for this, but as long as there's some unified location that the people on the research data services team, like the 8 or 10 of us, can query if we have questions about a specific data set, that goes there. The other thing is that due to the organization of the form, like if I have someone say that they're bringing me like multiple terabytes of data, I just immediately know that we need to talk to, I need to go talk to Dave in our repository team to make sure that we can actually handle that. And so the information right now just kind of statically sits in a Google Sheet on our, GDocs instance. We're trying to work on better processes for managing that than currently, but our current data deposit flow is not very high even yet. I mean, we could get probably like 5 or so data deposits that are complex data sets a month, if that. And so it's not hard to keep up, but we're trying to streamline the process so that if we end up getting a lot more stuff eventually, it won't become overwhelming.
Great. All right. The next question is, or the next 3 questions. Has there been a lot of work done or any policy guidance on the data ownership? Who has the rights to data placed into the repository? And does the university itself make any claim on the data?
That, in some instances, that comes down to specific agreements, but for the data that I'm talking about in KiltHub, it's an open repository, so the assumption is that anything that's going into KiltHub does not have rights restrictions or copyright issues that would prevent it from being shared as an open access data set. And so the assumption that we have is that if someone is coming to us and telling us that there's not restrictions on the data set, we will believe them until we're told otherwise. But the rights are usually reserved to the individual researcher, but I'm not directly familiar with how our copyright and data restrictions work vis-a-vis the Office of Tech Transfer and that type of thing. But I could definitely find out from Dave, who handles our scholarly communication and research curation, because he's much more versed in that. As far as the immediate stuff here, though, if it's going into KiltHub, we assume that it belongs to the researcher but is able to be shared open access, I think, is the biggest restriction there. And we encourage them to do it in full CC by 4, I think, which is like one of the least restrictive, or CC 0 if possible, but they can take different licenses if they want. But I do not think that the university itself maintains specific ownership unless there's a proprietary relationship that has been developed. And we do have a lot of data here from institutional and industrial and defense partnerships, and that does not show up in KiltHub at all because there's other processes that handle that.
Great. Any other questions?
Great.
So Eric, I have one final one. Eric, how long does it usually take for an average deposit workflow to go from the beginning of the process to the end where everything is deposited, assuming a competent research faculty is using the system?
I'd say the most recent example I have is the really good example that we just did with the electrical and computer engineer. And he had contacted us basically at the beginning of December, and then there was break where no one was doing anything. And then his deposit just came in today. So for his like A plus example, it was probably like 3 weeks of actual work time. But we can do we do faster turnarounds a lot of the time. I think our psychology liaison tries to do it within a couple days. Just depending on, it's more dependent on the researcher's schedule. Like if someone needs to get it in very, very quickly, we try to accommodate that. But if not, it's nice to take time and take like, 2 or 3 weeks to get everything described if there's not a rush. The issue is that a lot of times there's generally a rush for publication, and so we have a hard deadline and we do the best that we can. But we generally state that it'll take us at least 3 business days to do it on the short end, which isn't always respected, and we'd have to do it even faster. But hopefully it's that level. But it's very highly variable depending on the data set and like how happy the researcher is with working with us.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I hope it was informative for everyone.
Yeah. All right, we'll send out slides and a link to the recording next week. Again, thank you, Eric, for presenting. Hope everybody has a good day.
Thank you.